Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Today, a little farming 101. As consumers, it's important to know where our food comes from. When it comes to dairy farms, there are two categories, confinement or pasture. Each has its pros and cons, but don't think in terms of one versus the other or good and bad. What matters is determining what system will allow the farmer to be successful and keep the farm operation sustainable. Our teacher for this Farming 101 crash course is Jen Colby. She's the Pasture Program Coordinator for UVM's Extension Center for Sustainable Agriculture. Thanks for being here. Thank you. It's great to have you. So dairy farming is expensive no matter what system you use. Let's just, how do you even start a dairy farm? Just to get us going.
That's a much bigger question.
Huge.
It is a much bigger question. So it's a much bigger question is ultimately what it comes down to. So we have to evaluate what we like to do and how we like to do it, and that feeds totally into the questions about whether we do a pasture-based system, confinement-based system, or something in between. What do we really enjoy doing?
So that's that question, that first question you asked. Do you want to do dairy?
I think that is
problematic these days.
Absolutely. And so the pasture and confinement conversation is actually, it's bigger than dairy. It's all different kinds of livestock farms. And so there might even be some pictures today from all different kinds of farms as well.
Okay, well let's go to that. So management is key. Is that where we differentiate between conventional dairy farming and organic, say?
That's one of the ways. It's a different orientation toward management. It also has a lot to do with the inputs that we choose to use or not use. And one of the conversations around organic dairy is there is an absolute emphasis on pasture management as one, but it doesn't mean a lack of confinement either, because the truth is that we have winter for 6 months of the year in Vermont, so most farms are a combination of both systems.
Okay, well let's look at those pros and cons. So back to the pros of pasture-based.
Yeah. So pasture-based farming can be very low cost, very low input. Some of the benefits are that it can be very flexible. You can target where you put your animals for different land management changes. The emphasis on pasture-based farming is that great pasture management is about copying natural systems. So we're working with nature. We're trying to get nature to do a lot of the work for us rather than us needing to do everything ourselves.
Well, then what about the cons?
Well, pasture management can also be somewhat complicated. So it takes a mind shift, it takes an orientation toward working with nature, and so not everybody is really great at that, not everybody enjoys that necessarily. And then we get these sort of shoulder seasons. This spring has been a great example of that. Too much water may mean your animals should not be on pasture. They should be in a nice covered area, so that they're not harming the land themselves as well. So there are some cons to pasture too. We've got weather impacts, and we've got a lot of management challenges that can go along with that.
Right, which is why you list New England as one of the cons.
New England is one of the cons, is that we're not able to graze necessarily the entire year, which some other places are able to do that. So. Yeah.
So let's talk about confinement dairy farming, and let's look at the pros first.
So some of the pros are that we have a greater amount of control. So we can have more control over the diet the animals have. We can have a certain amount of protection in times of heat. There is certainly the ability to have fans and to have other ways to keep animals cool. And so it really does give us a certain amount of predictability that can not only be very comfortable, but particularly if you're in a dairy situation, you need to have a really good sense of what the animals are going to produce. Then that's why it can be a positive choice for some folks.
Great. And the cons to confinement?
So much of this comes back to management. So structures are expensive.
Right.
So that's one of those pieces when you ask about getting into dairy farming in general, or any kind of farming, is that when we build structures, they're expensive, and some are more expensive than others. The bigger, the more concrete, the more expensive they get. And management of a confinement system, it can go not so well and as well. So it's one of those things that's a pro or a con. The other piece is they don't have the ability to be as flexible. And so when you put a waterer, I think there's an example there, when you put a waterer in a place, you can't move it unless you spend a lot of money to move it to another part of the barn. So you really have to be very thoughtful about what you do, because the system doesn't have as much flexibility.
Right, so designing what happens inside is really important.
Designing, the forethought to design something that really works for you is really, really important, and also recognizing that you may not have the flexibility to change it later on.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that you list animal health on both the pro and the
I
con
do.
list. So could you go deeper into that?
Absolutely, absolutely. So what it comes down to, like all of these, is nothing is either entirely right or entirely wrong. It's a lot to do with, you know, what's a good fit, and so much of it comes back to management. And so I've been to farms that are highly confined farms that have lots of bedding, they're beautiful, they're clean, the animals are very healthy, and I've been to pasture-based farms where that is very true as well. So it has a lot to do with how we manage a system,
Right.
what the impacts that we get out of that system are.
Is one a lot more labor intensive, or they're both labor intensive in their own way?
They're labor intensive in their own way, I would say, and I reveal my bias as a pasture-based person in general, that I think that when we get the animals to do more of the work for themselves, when they feed themselves, when they spread their own manure, I think that there is less work involved in that. There's certainly less mechanization involved in that, and so it can be a less expensive way to go, and it's a very enjoyable way to go. But also, we may also decide that we need to confine animals to collect their manure for a while so that we can grab it and put it onto hay fields and other places. So there's
control thing. A little
exactly, and sort of deciding what we need to do.
Yeah, fantastic. So how do confinement and pastures stack up environmentally? So what does it do or not do for our farm? So start with confinement.
So that also has to do with a sort of management aspect as well. So so in a confinement system, there is the ability, like I said, to collect manure, to contain it, to keep it from running off. It allows an active composting process, or the ability to take what would be an undesirable concentration and turn it into something quite desirable, like a compost. So that in itself has the ability to be positive. If there is a breach in the containment system, then we have a concentration of nutrients, and that's not, that side of it is not so good. And then there's the pasture side too. So
let's look at the pasture side. So what environmentally, what are the benefits there?
Yeah, so environmentally, there's a whole lot of biodiversity that happens in a well-managed grazing system, and I'll be the first to admit not all are well-managed. That's really important. But a well-managed grazing system hits all of the points of soil health. So reducing tillage, keeping biodiversity, keeping the soil covered, all of that contributes to water quality, and livestock are a really important part of that in terms of soil biology.
Right. Okay, fantastic. And you also say there are social impacts to consider as well. So what do you mean by that, and what are those impacts?
I think that is really important for consumers, the general public, to understand what they're looking at when they go to farms. So whether they go to a confinement farm and they see cows in a barn, it does not necessarily mean that those cows are not healthy because they're not outside. It could mean that they're very, very healthy. And also when they go and see animals outside, on pasture, it doesn't mean that they need to be inside, and I hear that from both sides of farmers, where folks think animals need to be inside, not outside, and sometimes they need to be outside, not inside.
Right.
Yeah,
And they can
yeah.
certainly be both.
They can certainly be both and be well managed either way.
Right. So we've been talking about pros and cons of these different kinds of pasturing systems.
Yep.
We've been mainly talking dairy, but is this
Right.
true for other livestock?
It absolutely is true for all different kinds of livestock. And some animals are better adapted to being outside. Some animals are better adapted to being in. So dairy animals are not as well adapted to, say, side hills, really scrubby land that may be marginal land that may be a better fit for small ruminant animals that are a little lighter on the land. But the truth is that we can, it's just a matter of management, and for the farmer, it's about figuring out what are the pros and cons for you, and how can you come up with a good system that works for you and your animals.
And your land.
And your land,
what works
exactly,
with your
and your
land.
pocketbook.
Right, your pocketbook.
That too.
So if you are going to be farming with cows,
Yeah.
is there a difference between raising milk cows or meat cattle for meat?
Beef cows. So certainly beef cows are have often been selected to be more hardy in an outside system. They certainly can be an outwintered structure, so they lots of times just need some sheds or
A little shelter. but
Yeah, they
not-
need some shelter, but they don't necessarily need the same system that a dairy animal does. But they also have a lot more fat on their bodies and a little bit more protection from the elements than dairy cows.
So again, it's really looking at what kind of land do I have, what is the best thing for that, and how do I manage that?
Totally.
And
Yeah.
so how do they get those tips when they're going, well, I'm thinking I guess I need to talk to Jen.
Right? They're welcome to call us. They're absolutely welcome to call us in the Pasture program and the Center for Sustainable Agriculture. And we have colleagues in the Champlain Valley as well who do pasture management too.
Okay,
Yep.
so you can check in with UVM's Extension Service, and possibly, if you're really lucky, you'll get Jen on the other line in the Extension Service. There is the information, uvm.edu/extension/sustainable agriculture. Thank you for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard.